And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Lee Konitz, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first one's called Live at the Half Note. This album was recorded during a live event at the Half Note Jazz Club in 1959. There's some great tracks by a team comprising Bill Evans, Warne Marsh and others in collaboration with Lee Konitz. This album incorporates their innovations on chord changes in renditions of some jazz classics like April, Scrapple from the Apple and more. The next album is called Lee Konitz meets Jimmy Giuffre. This one's a blend of classical music and bebop and features a 5-saxophone ensemble including baritonist Jimmy Giuffre and a trio led by pianist Bill Evans. There's also a special performance by Giuffre on clarinet on a 5-part suite called Piece for Clarinet and String Orchestra. The next album is called Motian. This one's a collaboration between Konitz, drummer Elvin Jones and bassist Sonny Dallas. Many people call this his finest album. The album comprises of 5 jazz classics like I Remember You, You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To and more. And Lee Konitz Duets, another great album by Konitz. This one features him performing on several diverse duets. His bandmates on the different sessions include trombonist Marshall Brown, guitarist Jim Hall and others. The tracks include Strutting with Some Barbecue, Alphanumeric and others. The music ranges from Dixieland to free jazz to bop jazz. So that was some insight into some of the albums that we're going to be discussing during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Lee Konitz, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Live at the Half Note, released in 1959 on Verve Records. So Lee Konitz recorded this album during a live gig at the Half Note Jazz Club in New York. He was joined by Bill Evans, another great Miles Davis bandmate. There was also Warne Marsh in accompaniment. They have very complimentary saxophone solos, and Bill Evans is especially great on the solos. Evans once said Lee Konitz and Warne Marsh were 2 of his favorite horn players, and indeed a few years later he booked both of them to appear on one of his albums, Cross Currents, in 1977. The rhythm section is also top-notch with Jimmy Garrison on bass and Paul Motian on drums. Lee Konitz meets Jimmy Giuffre was released in 1959 on Verve Records. Jimmy Giuffre was a pioneer of the third stream jazz movement, which is all about infusing classical elements with jazz. He was also a leading saxophonist, clarinetist and composer of his time. So he's on top form in this album, which features 5 different saxophones and a rhythm section. There's Konitz on alto sax, Hal McCusick on second alto, Warne Marsh and Ted Brown, another former Tristano student, on tenor sax. Giuffre himself is on baritone sax. Konitz and Giuffre teamed up again a few months later for a similar album backed by a 6-piece brass section and rhythm section. The music alternates between classical jazz and bop. Giuffre also plays clarinet alongside his string section on a 5-part song called Piece for Clarinet and String Orchestra. Motion was released in 1961 on Verve Records. This is probably one of Konitz's greatest albums. There's 5 great renditions of songs from the Great American Songbook. He's all about improvising on the tunes. There's also a great instrumentalist section backing him. Bassist Sonny Dallas, another student of Tristano's. There was Elvin Jones, who was making waves for his fiery dynamic drumming with John Coltrane's quartet. He was a very dynamic drummer but also famous for his versatility as shown in this album. He opts for a more softer, gentle style to keep up with Konitz's saxophone playing. One critic, Dave Liebman, once said of his collaboration that it was one of the most artistic and deep recordings of standard material that I know, and a testament to the greatness of 2 jazz giants, Lee Konitz and Elvin Jones. One of the outstanding tracks on the album is the song Foolin' Myself, which is a Lester Young tribute. Lester once performed the song to massive success alongside singer Billie Holiday, and Konitz on alto accompanied by Sonny Dallas on bass solo is something of a tribute to Young. Lee Konitz Duets was released in 1968 on Milestone Records. In this album, Konitz alternates between alto saxophone and tenor saxophone, backed by a diverse range of instrumentals for each session. For instance, on the ballad You Don't Know What Love Is, he's backed by tenor saxophonist Joe Henderson. The song Strutting with Some Barbecue is themed on early jazz flavors, and sees him collaborating with valve trombonist Marshall Brown. The song ends with them playing Louis Armstrong's classic solo from the 1927 recording of the same song. So overall, this album comprises some of Lee's best sessions in one. His rendition of the song Duplexity is a very adventurous one, alongside violinist Ray Nance. He has 3 different duets in 5 versions of the songs alone together. The song Alphanumeric sees the entire ensemble coming together for a brilliant closing song. So that was some insight into more of Lee Konitz's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. We're going for a short break, we'll be right back after that, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Lee Konitz, his life and times and best hits. And now it's time for some trending festival news. The New England Conservatory Jazz Orchestra is set to perform on December 5th. The concert is a tribute to the legendary pianist, composer and bandleader Toshiko Akiyoshi. She won 14 Grammy nominations throughout her career and was leader of the Toshiko Akiyoshi Jazz Orchestra between 1982 and 2003. She started out playing in music halls in Japan at an early age. She graduated from the Berklee College of Music and formed the Toshiko Akiyoshi Jazz Orchestra in 1972. Her music blended Japanese themes with jazz. The concert features several of her best compositions like After Mr. 10, American Ballad, Long Yellow Road, Road Time Shuffle, Soliloquy and Tuning Up. For more information, please visit necmusic.edu. So that was some trending festival news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We are going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Lee Konitz's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Lee Konitz, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour. The first album is called I Concentrate on You. So Lee Konitz is big on innovating with his melodies. This one's a tribute album to Cole Porter and is one example of his groundbreaking ideas. He is paired with Red Michel on bass on the album. Together they perform some beautiful renditions of Cole Porter classics like Easy to Love, Every Time We Say Goodbye and Love for Sale. Lee Konitz Nonet was an album recorded by the Lee Konitz Nonet. The band features some top players like flugelhornist John Eckert, trombonist Jimmy Nepper and baritonist Ronnie Cuber. They play a wide repertoire of music like Sometimes I'm Happy, Giant Steps and some newer original compositions. And an album called Alone Together. This was Lee's first recording for Blue Note Records. The album is a compilation of relaxing bop melodies. Konitz teams up with bassist Charlie Hayden and pianist Brad Meldo on the tracks. So that was some insight into some of the albums that we're going to be discussing during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Lee Konitz, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called I Concentrate on You, released in 1974 on Steeplechase Records. This one's a tribute album to the great Cole Porter. In this album, Konitz is collaborating with double bassist virtuoso Red Michel, whose style was soloistic and very melodic. They tackled 12 Cole Porter classics together. Also, Michel's on piano on the song Night and Day, playing in a bop style. So Lee Konitz was very fond of experimenting and innovating, and this album is one great example. Their renditions of Cole Porter songs are very innovative and groundbreaking. Easy to Love is played out with a more melancholy tone than the original. On You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To, Konitz improvises beautifully. Love for Sale is unusually played out as a rather over-the-top melody, but in this one it's more understated. So in the 1970s, Konitz returned to his big band format of his early days, like his days alongside Miles Davis' Cool Nonet. He'd typically lead a 9-member group during this time that would tour in USA and Europe. The band was called the Lee Konitz Nonet and they recorded several great albums together. The band featured top players like flugelhornist John Eckert, trombonist Jimmy Nepper and baritonist Ronnie Cuber. This 1977 album features Konitz backed by Ronnie Cuber on baritone saxophone and a young Kenny Washington on drums. So there's a very complex song by Coltrane called Giant Steps, and this song is one of the highlights of the album. Konitz and his band perform a very fast-paced version of it. There's a great Louis Armstrong-inspired rendition of Strutting with Some Barbecue, and Sometimes I'm Happy, a Lester Young tribute. Alone Together is released in 1996 on Blue Note Records. In his latter years, Lee Konitz adopted a change in his style. He'd opt for a simpler style with a focus on improvising from note to note, and opting for slower tempos to enable him to achieve this. He'd also combine scat singing or improvisational singing alongside his saxophone melodies. He was also at his best when he was improvising over songs, most notably songs from the Great American Songbook, a compilation of some of the best songs from history. He frequently found new ways to portray a song through his innovative renditions of it each time it was performed. He would say of his improvising that, I think it's something similar to Monet painting the lily pond at all times of the day, catching the reflection of the light. So he would make several albums featuring these renditions, and Alone Together was one of his best efforts in that direction. On this album, which features 6 well-known jazz classics, he's joined by Brad Meldo on piano and Charlie Hayden on bass. Brad Meldo's bright, peppy style makes for the perfect complement with his relaxed, deeply melodic styles of Hayden and Konitz saxophone music. The three musicians are very innovative on the tracks, making for some dynamic, upbeat renditions of straight-ahead cool bop classics. They recorded a similar album the next year called Another Shade of Blue, and again in 2009 they were joined by Paul Motian for the album Live at Birdland. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Lee Konitz, his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were talking about during this program. So Lee Konitz was widely regarded as one of the leading cool jazz saxophonists of his time. He also recorded alongside other pioneers in cool jazz like the Miles Davis Cool Nonet, Claude Thornhill, Lennie Tristano and others. He also created a sound that was uniquely his own, recording and collaborating with a diverse range of instrumentalists and vocalists over his career. He started out playing the saxophone in New York City gigs. He then took up tutelage with Lennie Tristano, one of the proponents of the cool jazz revolution, and played alongside Miles Davis Nonet for a while. He then joined the Stan Kenton Big Band before starting out solo. Most of his recordings during the time were with pop musicians and with other students of Lennie Tristano's School of Music. He was also a big influence on West Coast alto saxophonists. So that was some insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called I Concentrate on You. So Lee Konitz was big on innovating with his melodies. This one's a tribute album to Cole Porter and is one example of his groundbreaking ideas. He's paired with Red Michel on bass on the album. Together they perform some beautiful renditions of Cole Porter classics like Easy to Love, Every Time We Say Goodbye and Love for Sale. Subconcious-Lee is an album recorded by Konitz in collaboration with some of his fellow students of Lennie Tristano's School of Music. The album features some fast-paced tracks, a swinging alternate to bebop. Other players on this album include saxophonist Warne Marsh, pianist Sal Mosca, and bassist Arnold Fishkin. Lee Konitz at Storyville is an album that came at the time when Konitz had broken away from Lennie Tristano's School of Music and was setting out as a bandleader. Lee Konitz meets Jimmy Giuffre is a blend of classical music and bebop. It features a 5-saxophone ensemble including baritonist Jimmy Giuffre and a trio led by pianist Bill Evans. There's also a special performance by Giuffre on clarinet on a 5-part suite called Piece for Clarinet and String Orchestra. And an album called Motian. This one's a collaboration between Konitz, drummer Elvin Jones and bassist Sonny Dallas. Many people call this his finest album. The album consists of 5 jazz classics like I Remember You, You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To and more. So that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on this week's episode of The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. You can check out the archives of today's show on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. So on that note, we've come to an end of this week's episode of The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.